Desmond Blackwood, a man with a perfect career and a model family life, is deeply prejudiced against homosexuals. In a project, he is forced to cooperate with Adrian Pierce, an openly gay photographer. From here, Desmond's life begins to slide off the orbit. The long-repressed obsessions arise, causing him to fall into a dark spiral of psychological conflicts that pushes him into a dangerous spiral, leading to an irreversible tragedy. Desmond Blackwood, 38, is proud of what he sees as the pinnacle of success: a coveted position at a prestigious law firm, a beautiful wife, and a luxurious home in a prestigious neighborhood. For Desmond, these accomplishments are not only a measure of his personal success, but also a symbol of the unshakable traditional values he holds dear. His life is built on a rigid moral code where everything must conform to a standard mold. But deep inside, Desmond harbors a terrible contradiction. He holds homosexuality in intense contempt, seeing it not only as wrong, but as a terrible threat to the order he has worked so hard to protect. The presence of what he sees as deviance creates cracks in the flawless walls of his carefully constructed life. However, Desmond's success only strengthens his conviction that he has the right to judge and eliminate anything that goes against what he sees as right, reinforcing his belief that he is the one who maintains social order. Desmond's mind is torn between two opposing poles. He has always believed in the perfect family of a father, mother, and children raised in a conservative environment with rigid principles about normal life. But the difference he ignores also haunts him. For Desmond, homosexual relationships are not only a moral challenge, but also a dangerous threat, capable of destroying the ideal world he has always tried to maintain. This contradiction constantly tears him apart. On one side, the rigid traditional values he believes in; on the other, the growing instability that differences bring to his mind. Although Desmond has built a perfect picture of married life with Celeste, that perfection gradually becomes a fragile shell. His marriage to his model wife, by all standards set by society, seems to be nothing more than a cold arrangement. They had been together for years, but behind the facade was an unbridgeable distance. The passion that once burned brightly was now an echo, an emptiness that neither dared to acknowledge. Every moment between them was a contrast between the happy exterior and the suffocating, inescapable feeling. Desmond feels trapped in a life he has tried to keep perfect, flawless, but his strict adherence to the rules he has set for himself is stifling any real emotions. Deep down, Desmond longs for passion and connection, but those are increasingly slipping away, giving way to the monotonous, dry repetition of everyday life. He cannot escape the limits he has created for himself, but feels frustrated and dissatisfied when bound by those rules. Both Desmond and Celeste are caught in a spiral of conflict. They still maintain the role of the ideal couple in the eyes of society, but inside, their dissatisfaction gradually becomes an obsession. Desmond wants everything to be perfect his way, but that makes him feel trapped in a soulless reality. He always craves difference, but does not allow himself to escape the framework he has built, pushing both of them into a state of conflict and discomfort. The tension and conflict in their relationship still simmers until a new element suddenly appears, pushing Desmond into an emotional whirlwind that he never expected. Everything begins to change when the law firm where Desmond works receives a new project involving a famous photographer, Adrian Pierce. Desmond, as the lead lawyer on the project, has no choice but to work directly with this client, even though he has heard rumors that Adrian is openly gay. Desmond cannot deny the discomfort in his heart every time he comes into contact with Adrian. While his reason commands him to keep his distance, his heart and emotions constantly pull him towards Adrian. A part of Desmond always wonders why Adrian can live so freely, while he himself is imprisoned by the rules and prejudices he has set for himself. The appearance of Adrian marks a turning point in Desmond's life, a turning point that he could not have expected. The first day he met Adrian, Desmond immediately felt uncomfortable. Adrian walked into his office with confidence, an artistic style, and a charming smile. Adrian looked relaxed and free, not caring about the eyes of others, something Desmond always tried to maintain. Adrian's appearance exuded a confidence that Desmond secretly envied but despised, because it was the complete opposite of the rules he had followed all his life. The conversation between Desmond and Adrian was immediately tense. Adrian did not hide himself. He naturally talked about his work as an artistic photographer, about his life and relationships in a humorous and straightforward manner. Meanwhile, Desmond tried to keep a straight face, occasionally responding reluctantly. He did not want to interact too much with this person, and especially did not want to hear stories about a lifestyle that I considered improper. But Adrian ignored Desmond's coldness. He continued the conversation, breaking down the wall that Desmond had built with his confidence and humor. Every time Adrian laughed, Desmond felt a wave of resistance rise up inside him, as if a deep-seated resistance was rising. He told himself that he was just uncomfortable because he was facing someone he disagreed with, but in reality, a part of him couldn't take his eyes off Adrian. The next meetings were no easier. With each meeting, Desmond felt more and more uncomfortable in Adrian's presence. He tried to maintain a professional distance, but Adrian always knew how to make the atmosphere comfortable, making Desmond uncomfortable. Adrian's stories about his free life, artist parties, photography exhibitions, openly gay relationships were things Desmond could never have dreamed of. There is always a struggle within him between a conservative man, constrained by the framework, and another man full of freedom, living true to his true nature. Desmond's inner conflict grew. He felt disgusted with Adrian, but at the same time, a part of him couldn't deny the strong attraction. He wondered why he was so influenced by Adrian. His mind told him it was wrong, but his emotions told him otherwise. Thoughts of Adrian began to linger in Desmond's mind, and this made him panic even more. How could a man like him who had everything be attracted to something he always thought was wrong? Desmond returned home after each meeting with Adrian, feeling unable to escape the turmoil inside. Celeste didn't notice this change. She was still happy with her job, still believing that everything was fine. But Desmond knew that his life was no longer as perfect as before. Something had changed, and it started with the first sight of Adrian. Desmond felt Adrian's presence everywhere. Whether working, driving, or sitting next to Celeste at dinner, the image of Adrian's easy smile and confident eyes always appeared, like an inescapable ghost. Desmond's life became a constant storm. The conflicting emotions inside him grew stronger. What had once been hatred gradually turned into a fierce obsession. Every night, lying next to Celeste, Desmond couldn't help but think about Adrian, about his smile, his confident gaze, and his comfortable presence. Desmond's feelings were no longer just curiosity or admiration, but something darker and more dangerous. One day, in the office, Desmond received a text message from Adrian about a new art event he was going to attend. It wasn't the first time Adrian had invited Desmond, but this time there was something different. Desmond not only felt drawn into Adrian's world, but he also felt a fear that he would lose Adrian if he didn't act. He began to imagine Adrian with other people, other men, and it drove him crazy. That night, Desmond couldn't control himself. After a long day of trying to hide the chaos inside, he felt like he could no longer maintain his composure. He drove frantically through the city streets, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. Desmond stepped on the gas, the roar of the engine seeming to match his chaotic state. The world around him seemed to have lost all meaning. Everything became blurred before the obsession that was consuming his mind. When he arrived at Adrian's event venue, Desmond walked in with extreme tension. The noisy atmosphere of the exhibition did not calm him down, but only pushed him further into chaos. In Desmond's mind, everything began to go haywire, anger and jealousy rising. He saw Adrian standing in the crowd, laughing happily, but next to Adrian was another man, a man Desmond did not know but immediately became his rival in his mind. Desmond felt like he couldn't breathe. His heart was pounding, as if it was about to burst from his chest. The feeling of betrayal, even though Adrian had never promised anything, made Desmond feel like he was about to explode. He knew he couldn't control himself anymore. Every step Desmond took felt heavy, as if he was being pulled into a world he could no longer control. As Adrian and the other man moved outside, Desmond couldn't stop. He watched them from a distance, his heart pounding like a storm. Desmond felt like he was about to face an explosion he couldn't foresee. Images of Adrian and the other man laughing and sharing intimate moments filled Desmond's mind. He imagined the conversations they would have, the intimacy that only he was allowed to have with Adrian. Jealousy was like a storm destroying whatever reason he had left. In the darkness, he silently followed Adrian, his eyes glued to his back, each step heavy, but his heart filled with hysteria. Coming to a deserted street, Adrian and the man stopped to talk. Unable to bear it any longer, Desmond stepped forward, his breath quickening and his eyes blazing. He felt all the emotions he had been suppressing for so long burst out. In that moment, Desmond was no longer the calm, rational man he once knew. He was a completely different person, haunted and dragged by uncontrollable emotions. Adrian turned around, his eyes filled with surprise when he saw Desmond. But that surprise only made Desmond more tense. Every muscle in his body tensed, as if everything in his body was about to explode. Desmond couldn't bear to see Adrian with someone else. It made him feel like the whole world was collapsing before his eyes. Everything became blurry, and Desmond felt only one emotion: anger. Desmond's mind was no longer clear. What he wanted to do, He didn't know, but he couldn't bear to see Adrian continue to drift away from him, to continue living a life that Desmond could never be a part of. In that moment, Desmond realized he had gone too far, but instead of stopping, he pressed forward, his eyes blazing with anger and despair. Desmond felt a change in the way he looked at Adrian, but not in the way he expected. At a company party to celebrate the success of a project, Desmond drank quite a bit. No longer able to maintain his usual sobriety and restraint, he felt himself being drawn into a whirlpool of emotions that he had long tried to deny. When Adrian stood alone at the bar, Desmond, his heart in turmoil and his blood intoxicated, approached and hugged Adrian, suddenly confessing all his pent-up feelings. In that moment, he kissed Adrian, wanting to break down all barriers and cross the limits he had built for himself. However, Adrian did not respond. The silence between them became heavy, and Desmond realized that Adrian had stepped back, rejecting his gestures and confession. In Adrian's eyes, there was no expectation or sympathy, but clear rejection. Adrian understood that things could not go any further and knew that Desmond's feelings were not something he could accept. Adrian's rejection was like a bucket of cold water poured on Desmond, bringing him back to painful reality. Returning from the party, Desmond felt a mess. All the emotions, the urges he had tried to control, had now been shattered in a single drunken moment. Adrian's rejection was not only a blow to his heart, but also pushed Desmond into an internal struggle that had no way out. But as the door closed behind him, Desmond did not feel the release he had hoped for. Instead, a feeling of emptiness gradually enveloped him. Returning to his daily life, Desmond realized that everything was now just an empty shell. He was still by Celeste's side, still going to the company every day, but nothing really existed or had any meaning. The feeling of loss came not only from Adrian's rejection, but more deeply from the loss of himself. Desmond understood that his life would never be the same again. As much as he tried to deny the truth, Desmond could not deny that he had changed. The moment with Adrian, though long gone, had left a deep mark on his heart. The emptiness seemed to never go away, and every time Adrian's image appeared, Desmond felt as if he had lost a part of himself that could never be recovered. His mind fell into a spiral of contradiction, stuck between the past and the present. He could not continue with his old life, but he could not move on to anything new when everything now felt meaningless and empty. Day by day, Desmond was engulfed in the darkness of regret and obsession. He had thought that he could escape his inner turmoil by returning to his family life. But the more he tried to return to his old orbit, the deeper he felt himself falling into an endless abyss. Adrian's image was constantly present in his mind. The brief but emotional moments between them haunted Desmond every second. Desmond tried to fill the void by focusing on work, on family, but every effort only brought disappointment. He could no longer look at Celeste with the same eyes as before. Every time she tried to get close, Desmond felt like a liar. Celeste's words, her intimate gestures, now only made Desmond feel more guilty and empty. He could no longer play the role of the perfect husband he once was. Nightmares began to appear every night. In the dream, Desmond always found himself standing in the middle of a dark, cold room. Adrian was there, but every time he approached, Adrian disappeared into the darkness. There were times when Adrian looked at Desmond with a challenging gaze, as if mocking his weakness and confusion. Those dreams made Desmond wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. But what scared him most wasn't the dream, but the growing sense that he was losing control. One evening, after returning home from a stressful day at work, Desmond realized that he could no longer pretend. Everything in his life had become fake. He stood in front of the mirror, looking into his own eyes, but he no longer recognized the man he once knew. His mind was a jumble of confusion. In his head, images of Adrian and Celeste were mixed together, like two opposing worlds fighting for control of his mind. Desmond began to see Adrian everywhere, even when Adrian was not there. In random moments, when he was driving or sitting at work, he felt as if someone was watching him from afar. His visions of Adrian became more and more vivid and haunting. Desmond imagined Adrian laughing at him, along with his new man. They stood before him, laughing, but everything in Desmond's world was falling apart. He began to believe that his life had no meaning without Adrian. One particular night, while Celeste was sleeping, Desmond could not bear it any longer. He got out of bed, walked downstairs in the dark, and sat in the empty living room. Echoes of his dream kept ringing in his head, Adrian saying that Desmond's life was just a fake play, that he could never go back to the way it was. Desmond didn't know how long he sat there, but by the time he realized it, it was already dawn. Last night, everything in his life had fallen apart. The guilt of his fake life pushed Desmond into a state of despair. He couldn't accept living without Adrian, but he couldn't continue to pretend to be the model husband. His relationship with Celeste gradually became strained. Celeste began to notice a clear change in Desmond. She felt abandoned, forgotten in a marriage she had once believed in. The distance between them grew, but Desmond couldn't find a way to fix it. One evening, after Celeste tried to talk to Desmond about her feelings, he could no longer hold back. Celeste's reproaches and anger unleashed the anger and helplessness that Desmond had been suppressing for so long. He screamed in despair, spilling out everything that had happened between him and Adrian, about the feeling of stalemate and the obsession he was suffering from. Celeste began to notice the distance in their marriage. Desmond would often sit in the dark in the evenings, his eyes looking far away, as if chasing something she could not reach. Whenever she tried to get close to him, he would only respond with cold, distant touches. The fear that she was losing him began to rise in her heart. Celeste looked at him, unable to believe her ears. She stood there, tears streaming down her face, unable to believe that the husband she had loved for so many years would betray her so cruelly. Those words not only hurt Celeste, but also completely destroyed their family. Both of them understood that there was no way to fix this marriage. The room became stifling. The space was so thick that it felt like the fresh air had been sucked out. Desmond sat across from Celeste, feeling like a storm was slowly rising in his heart. A feeling of unease gradually spread, seeping into every breath he took. He knew that what was about to happen could not be reversed. The seconds passed slowly, in heavy anticipation. And then, Desmond began to tell the truth that had been hidden for so long. His confession poured out like a stream of water that had been held back for too long, spilling over the embankment. Celeste's expression immediately changed. Surprise quickly turned to shock, and then to a sudden anger. Her eyes flashed with pain and disappointment, each emotion clearly written on her face. Desmond could feel the waves of emotion churning inside her like a raging sea. He could feel the anger slowly spreading through Celeste, growing stronger by the second, like a volcano waiting to erupt. She stood up from her chair, her movements forceful, as if reflecting her uncontrollable anger. Her body was tense, her breathing rapid. There were no more gentle gestures or kind words, only pure anger. Each step she took on the floor seemed to want to collapse everything around her. Unspoken questions rang out, stabbing straight into Desmond's mind like sharp blades. He knew that she could not accept this truth, could not forgive the betrayal he had caused. The atmosphere between them became more tense than ever. Everything seemed to freeze, leaving only the heavy emotions tearing at the two people who once loved each other. Desmond felt each wave of anger from Celeste pouring into him, his body reacting with extreme tension. He could see the deep disappointment in her eyes, feel the fury gradually choking the space between them. The whole room seemed to become an invisible battlefield, where the silence of words was filled with waves of fierce arguments. Panic began to rise in Desmond. The voices in his head grew louder, screaming like echoes from hell. Images of Adrian flickered in and out of his mind, drowning out all of Desmond's attempts at control. He no longer saw Celeste as he had before. Instead, Adrian's face took over, her cold eyes and contemptuous smile hovering in his mind. Desmond felt his heart beat faster, the blood rushing to his head. He couldn't tell the difference between reality and the haunting thoughts in his head. The feeling of frustration and despair weighed heavily on his chest, and he didn't know what to do. Celeste's every step, her every helpless shake of her head, added fuel to the fire burning inside Desmond. The pressure reached its peak, and then, in a moment of complete loss of control, Desmond lunged toward the knife on the table. Everything around him seemed to slow down, but in his mind, everything was happening at a dizzying speed. He could no longer feel his hands shaking, could no longer hear his own rapid breathing. Everything was swallowed up by a dark, chaotic, haunting storm of emotions. When the cold blade touched the flesh, there was no scream, only a terrifying silence. Blood flowed out, soaking the floor, but Desmond could not perceive it. He stood there, staring at Celeste, or at least what was left of her in his mind. Everything became hazy, blurred between reality and illusion. The image of Adrian appeared again, clearer than ever, as if mocking his weakness and madness. Desmond felt his heart rate gradually slow down after the panic, but his head was still spinning, hazy between reality and illusion. Cold sweat slid down his forehead, but the chaos in his mind had not yet subsided. The feeling of disorientation made him unable to remember what had just happened. Only fragments of memories remained, as if covered by a thick layer of fog. As he gradually regained consciousness, the image of Celeste lying on the floor suddenly appeared, blood spreading from her body, soaking the cold wooden floor. Her eyes were lifeless, her hands hanging limply. Desmond felt his body freeze, the seconds ticking by, as he slowly understood the horror before him. The world around him seemed to stop, leaving only emptiness. He knelt beside Celeste, his trembling hands touching her blood, feeling the coldness of her life slowly draining away.